Okay, I think we're ready to start. We're going to move right along. Welcome to the second roundtable discussion on public-private partnerships. I will be your guide as we discuss this topic. I just wanted to remind anybody who, when we have the opportunity to engage questions from the audience, please use the microphone so you can be recorded onto the video. And before we start with brief introductions about each of the initiatives that our panel is here to discuss, I'd just like to express regrets from one of our panel members, Rebecca Roth. She is from Maine and the airport is closed due to the storm. So if you see me on my iPad during this time, she has sent some thoughts that she would like to get on record. So whether that's in the wrap-up session or now, depending how the discussion goes, you might see me looking at her notes. And so it was great that she could send those in writing. I also wanted to remind you, as Admiral White mentioned this morning, I'll be seeking to glean a handful of critical takeaways, best practices, needed legislation or regulation, or a critical methodology in the evolution of public-private partnerships from this round panel. I'd like to thank COL for inviting me to moderate this panel because partnerships has been something that has been ever present in my career. I currently am working with 2 different NOP projects, and for the past 10 years, I've been the science advisor on a Sound and Marine Life joint industry program, which is organized by the International Association for Oil and Gas Producers. So these joint industry programs bring multiple oil and gas companies together to focus on a problem that's common to all. And it's been great to watch the evolution of the oil and gas industry partnering with academia, with some of our federal agencies to co-sponsor projects, and with environmental NGOs, bringing them all together to work productively to make progress on a specific topic. And I'm joined today by 3 other people that I'm sure public-private partnerships plays a large role. And before I ask you to talk about your organization, I'm just going to give a brief intro to each person so you know where they come from. So far to my left here is Dr. Pamela Plotkin. She's the current director for the Texas Sea Grant Program and a faculty member at Texas A&M University's College of Geoscience in the Department of Oceanography. She is also a previous John Knaus Marine Policy Fellow, and I bring this up because that is a great example, that fellowship program is a great example of public-private partnerships. She's joined by Chris Sari. Chris is from the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. She joined the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation as president and CEO in 2016, and she works to build on the foundation's strong history of collaboration and expand its partnerships to protect America's natural resources and to ensure the ocean and Great Lakes communities remain healthy for future generations. And next to me is Commander John Marburger from the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. The commander is a Navy senior service lead and a program manager within the artificial intelligence and autonomy portfolios at DIUX in the Silicon Valley. DIUX's mission is to accelerate commercial technologies into the Department of Defense across 5 different portfolios: artificial intelligence, autonomy, human systems, information technology, and space. So I think we're going to start our panel off with a few questions for discussion amongst the panel, and then we'll open it up to more audience engagement. But I wanted to set the tone for what public-private partnerships are, or P3. It's a lot easier to say, and we won't get tongue-tied up here, so we can say P3. And so I'd like each of you to just start sort of describing your organization and how your organization defines or views public-private partnerships.
Sure. Howdy. So I'm the director of Texas Sea Grant, and I've been with Texas Sea Grant for 6 years now. And we are part of a network of Sea Grant programs that are located across the country in coastal states and Great Lakes states. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Sea Grant network, we are a partnership between NOAA and our states. And we receive federal funds, and we provide matching state funds to match those federal funds. And we address needs of our states. And We are a network that supports merit-based research and supports education, engagement, outreach, and extension. And among us, we have over 500 boots on the ground in our coastal states, working with private industry, nonprofit organizations, federal agencies, state agencies, and some might think of us, hopefully, as the masters of partnerships. We leverage our funds probably better than just about any other federally funded program, and we address the needs in our coastal communities. And once we identify the needs in our coastal communities, we translate those needs up to our universities. And our universities and our great researchers in those universities create the knowledge that we need to address many of the coastal issues that are present in our coastal states. Texas Sea Grant has been in existence for a little over 47 years now, and during that time we've partnered with just about everybody we possibly could in the state of Texas, and I look forward to telling you a little bit more about that in the next hour.
Thanks, Pamela. My name is Chris Seri. I'm the president and CEO of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. I'm really happy to be here. So Admiral Wright, thank you very much for inviting me and for this great forum for looking at science and technology and public-private partnerships. So for folks that don't know the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation or the National Marine Sanctuary System, we are the private nonprofit partner to the National Marine Sanctuary System, which are 13 sites around the country established to protect areas of national significance. So I kind of think I have one of the best jobs because I just get to go into work every day and try to figure out how we protect these really treasured areas for future generations by building partnerships, whether it's on science, conservation, education, or community stewardship. So it's at the absolute heart of what we try to do is we're very place-based, and our places are our sanctuaries, and then what we try to do is figure out how we bring as many partners into those sites to really help us protect those areas, conserve those areas for future generation. For me, in terms of what kind of public-private partnerships mean, and it's a really good question to start off with, just because it is challenging. Everybody defines it a little differently. But I look at it actually as some sort of legal or contractual relationship that is between a public entity, and it can be at the state, local, federal level, and a private, whether it's a business or, in my case, a nonprofit organization. What we're really trying to do is figure out how to combine the skills and the knowledge of the public and private sector to deliver a service to the public for its good. And in that process, hopefully both enjoy sharing in the risks and the rewards of what that partnership really can bring. And in my case, really for the marine environment as overall.
Thank you, Chris. I thought that was great. So first of all, Admiral, thank you for having me. I want to thank the consortium for inviting me here to represent DIUX to share essentially what we're doing, as well as how we're doing it and how we're changing the narrative, I think, in the public-private space. In another life, I used to work for Admiral White on Navy's Task Force on Climate Change at the Naval Observatory. I'm super happy to be back here inside the Beltway to talk about, I think, this very important topic, because I think that climate change is still very near and dear to my heart. And I do think that public-private partnerships are really going to be a way that we end up moving forward most rapidly in the issues of climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation especially. So I'm a meteorologist and a physical oceanographer by trade, so I guess it makes sense that I'm here to talk with you all in this setting. However, I want to double tap on an issue that came up earlier, which is the idea of partnerships, like Chris just said, is discipline agnostic. I think that's important to reinforce. And like the Admiral said earlier, it is kind of like dating in a lot of ways, right? You kind of go through this list of people that you could end up partnering with, and do I really want to ask them out? Then you go out on a date, and it's like, well, that didn't really work out very well. And sometimes you can go out on like 10, 11 dates, and you're starting to feel really bad about yourself. And then suddenly you go out and it clicks, right? So I think that that's an important piece of things. So real quick show of hands, how many people before today had heard of DIUX? Okay, so maybe 10%? I keep numbers, and hopefully we're on an exponential growth pattern here. So real quickly about how we started. We started in 2015 when then Secretary of Defense Ash Carter put about 10 of us into Silicon Valley, and in his words, we were his startup for the purposes, really just one purpose. It was to find commercial technology that was high TRL, so essentially very, like, we'll say technology readiness level 6 or higher, that was innovative in nature, and we were supposed to acquire that technology in some way, shape, or form without any sort of a plan. We had to make this up as we went for the purposes of getting it into the hands of sailors, Marines, airmen, and soldiers within a period of 2 years. So in a way, we were chartered to do exactly what this panel and this forum is trying to talk about. And I'm here to essentially share lessons learned, because we definitely had quite a few of them. We were kind of thrown into the fire in Silicon Valley amongst a whole bunch of VC, venture capital folks, a whole bunch of people that really had a skeptical eye towards the Department of Defense. And we were able to develop a process that has now resulted in the signing of 62 different prototype and production other transactions valued at over $200 million. This has all been done in the period of about 21 months. And we now have venture capitalists that are coming to us to look at the market space. We have companies that are coming to us because they know that we don't take an equity stake in their company, but we provide a revenue stream for the institution of a prototype or a production OT. And so we're starting to form this very symbiotic relationship with the Department of Defense again in Silicon Valley that hasn't really been there since we were trying to beat the Russians into space. So with that, I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
All right, thank you. I think our best way to move forward is to, let's talk about some of your successful dates. And so if you could, please share an experience where you had a very successful public-private partnership and maybe a lesson learned from that, or what an element of that relationship that made it successful. And I don't, if anyone was sure.
I'll take a stab at that one. So I'm going to talk about a date that began before I joined Texas Sea Grant. And it started in 2008 and continues to this day. And the partnership developed out of the need to help our Texas shrimp fishery become more resilient. At the time, diesel fuel prices were skyrocketing, and shrimp prices at the market were plummeting. And our greatest fishery, our biggest fishery, our most productive fishery in Texas was hurting. And so Texas Sea Grant was instrumental in leading a partnership of groups, which included Western Seafood Company, which is a private company that fishes for shrimp in the Gulf of Mexico, the Ocean Conservancy, Texas Sea Grant, and the Walton Foundation. And together, they looked at technology in other countries that were using similar fishing techniques to try to determine if there were any fishing techniques in those other countries that would reduce fuel consumption in the Texas shrimp fishery. And what they found were some not so innovative things like webbing on the nets that were lighter and more durable being used in other countries. They found the doors, which are at the front of the net in other countries, were much lighter than the doors that our shrimp fishermen were using on their nets. And those two technology changes introduced into the Texas shrimp fishery reduced the drag of those nets as the fishermen were fishing and resulted in significant fuel savings for our shrimp fishery. And between 2008 and 2014, the fishermen who participated in this program saved $41 million in fuel costs. And so we were able to develop this incredible partnership at a time when our industry needed it the most, and it was a great success. Everybody contributed, everybody shared in that success, and our shrimp fishery benefited from it tremendously.
Sure. So I'll actually touch on one that the senator just mentioned, which is Saildrone. So the NOAA folks in the crowd, you have a contract with Saildrone, primarily for the purposes of using them for sensing, like she said, in the Arctic. But any sort of exercise that NOAA wants to use, they have a contract with Saildrone, which is a company out of Alameda. The CEO is a guy named Richard Jenkins. He actually was well known for setting the land speed record for a wind-powered car. And he took and he applied that technology to a sailboat that was autonomous for the purposes of primarily, he's a huge climate change guy, of matter of fact, for the purposes of gathering oceanographic and atmospheric data. So DIUX signed a prototype contract with them, our customer, because we're a demand-driven organization at DIUX. We don't go out and drive technology acquisition. We have people from the Department of Defense and other agencies within the government tell us their problems, and then we advertise those problems, and then people bid, essentially, or tell us how they would go about solving those problems. So Saildrone came back. Our customer was a bunch of Navy SEALs. And they said, we have problems with sensing where we want to go ashore ahead of time. Can you help us? And so with that prototype with Saildrone, we were able to prove two things. We were able to prove that we could remotely pilot the Saildrones. So they're not subject to coal regs, which is a big deal if you're a drone on the water. Yeah, so now you were going to say that. Regulations for collision regulations. Thank you. Boy, I flashed back to an OOD board on the carrier here for a second. So yeah, collision regulations, if you're small enough, you don't have to essentially follow the rules of the road when you're at sea. And we were also able to prove that we were able to switch out a sensor. So the standard 16 sensors that were on there, we were able to add one. And so now we have the ability for anyone in the United States Navy, if they want, to sign what we call a production other transaction with us that will have a ceiling over generally a 5-year period, which is how the Pentagon works in budgeting. And you can have access to Saildrones. So they have the ability to stay on station for 6 months at a time. They don't really have to be maintained outside of that period. They go 4 to 8 knots, and what they amount to is a floating command and control platform for the purposes of information and sensor gathering. For the people in this room that are very interested in data, all the while they're doing this work for maybe a Navy SEAL or someone else within the United States military, they can be gathering data from essentially the mast to the keel that is oceanographic and atmospheric in nature. So it's been a fantastic partnership. It's worked out well, and I think the reasons why it has is we've both looked out for each other's interests. We haven't tried to tell Saildrone what they should do or who they shouldn't partner with. All we've said is we have a problem. Can you help solve it?
Great. Well, I'm going to mention a program I was out with the last week called Vessel Speed Reduction. So we had some very smart students at UC Santa Barbara notice that there was a problem with the shipping lanes up and down the West Coast and whale strikes taking place. So they did a study working with one of the sanctuaries, and we're seeing the ships going at the speeds that they were trying to get to the ports, striking whales. At the same time, there was a lot of knowledge by air quality control districts that the ships moving that close to shore were creating a lot of air quality problems for them, and there are a number of non-attainment areas. And it was through the sanctuaries, and this is where I really love that sanctuaries can be these kind of innovation hubs for communities. We were actually able to pilot a program for 2 years with Channel Islands Sanctuary, and then for the last year we actually did all the sanctuaries along the West Coast lining California. And we were able to provide an incentive payment to the shipping companies to get them to slow down to 10 to 12 knots. And through that incentive program, we noticed a couple of different things happened. Once, if there was a ship strike, the reduction in the mortality or the risk of mortality decreased significantly for whales. And they saw a very noticeable change in air quality for communities. And it was a very cost-effective, because trying to take care of air quality issues in California in a cost-effective manner is very difficult for states and communities. And so they found a highly cost-effective way to do that. What the foundation was really able to do is kind of come in and help stitch together, you know, the state private, the state public entity, the federal public entity, the shipping companies, of which there were 11 this year, to really kind of build the program out, help support the research, and then actually help promote this out in terms of why we should be doing more with slowing down vessels. And I think what was really key there, and this is just to hit on a couple of things about public-private partnerships, is first, you actually really, in these public-private partnerships, I think you really need a strong public partner. There has to be kind of a champion for you. There's a lot of different stakeholders often involved in the public-private partnership, and also that public partner, whoever that is a really very kind of key component to it. So that's one of my kind of big, I think, take-homes for that. The other one that was kind of clear around this was sometimes with public-private partnerships, you need to make sure there's a strong statutory environment for it to occur. In this case, actually, what was a driving factor behind this was wanting to avoid having to create regulations in this particular space. So there was a statutory environment around the public-private partnership and what we did, but actually it was this driver of trying to find an innovative solution, working with the private sector to avoid kind of a regulatory change that led all of these partners to come together. So that kind of environment is also something I think is really key too.
Thank you. Before we open up the mics, I think maybe briefly, if you can, without specific details, sort of describe a bad date or a partnership that didn't work out the way that you wanted it to. And if you can, identify maybe what element was a contributing factor to that not working out as you had planned.
I can speak real quickly to that. So I think that the reason why DIUX was formed was because we were having bad dates for about 30 or 40 years. I won't go to any specific type of issues, but we were essentially losing the race in innovation to our adversaries. So that speaks to exactly how many bad dates we were going on. I guess the key points about why they went bad is that there were processes that were in place and were widely accepted within the Pentagon that specifically disincentivized people that were at the cutting edge of technology and innovation from trying to work, because, as we say in DIUX, the military was moving at the speed of smell instead of the speed of sound, or hopefully the speed of light, right? You don't want to move slowly. It's not that these people don't care within the commercial sector. They are patriots in many ways, like all of us in this room are. However, they have a financial responsibility to their CEOs the same way that we have financial responsibilities to the taxpayers. And you in academia have, responsibilities, and you have to answer to chancellors and presidents. So if you don't have the ability to work in a fast way, you can either take two ways of addressing that issue. You can say, well, they just don't care. They don't care as much as I do, so therefore we'll just go ahead and we'll write them off. That's probably a little absolutist and a little bit too easy. But really what it is that you haven't, and by you I mean we, have not made the case to them commercially that it's going to be worth their time and applying their resources in a way that is going to be fiscally responsible for them and is going to essentially not get them fired. These companies only have so much resources, just like the government has, and they have to pick and choose based on opportunity cost about who they're going to go on a date with.
I agree with that the acknowledgement that you're working with the private sector and those needs that they have, and the need, whether it's a profit one or a shareholder one, is really key. The one I'm going to mention is the one time I know we saw a failure was what I call getting out of alignment between the two partners. One of the things that I think is really key with public-private partnership is clearly defined roles for each of the partner and clearly defined goals and a lot of communications. And so I've saw a failure where if you didn't define that up front, you can start drifting away from each other, and then sometimes bringing things back together for the success of that partnership can be very challenging.
We haven't had any bad dates.
Nice, 40 years, no bad dates.
Okay, well, you've heard a little bit about where things can be very positive with private-public partnerships and where there are some rough spots and challenges. I'm going to open it up right now to see if there's any pressing comments or questions from the audience before we move on with some of our discussion up here. I'm not seeing anyone jump up. Oh, there we go.
I'm Peter Yinger with L3 Maripro. And Commander, I'm happy to hear you say what you said, because our company has spent certainly in the last couple of years, but in the last several years, more than we've ever spent on IRAD. And the reason is because we see needs that the Navy has, and sorry, this is to ONR and other organizations too. We see real needs, and so we're investing our money. We're willing to do it. We go to our customers, talk to them about it. The problem is acquisition process. That's what's broken. So what I would encourage you to do is to go back to the Navy and see if you can share some of what you're learning through how the private sector does stuff quickly, because I would argue private companies, we have to move quickly or we'll have to find a job somewhere else, is the way it kind of works. But we're totally willing to work with anybody, and in the research community too. And we were part of the OOI, of course, with RSN and Neptune Canada and all those systems too. And there was a lot of our own money that we invested in that, and we're trying to move that forward into the Navy and certainly other areas too. So lessons that you learned, I'd be interested to know how you could help the big building that's over there with the sides on it. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for saying that. Maybe this is a good time to talk about the process that DIUX uses, because all of this stuff didn't just magically happen. The ability for us to do this, one, we had to be put out there by the Secretary of Defense, and since then, by the way, we've expanded and we have offices, a small office in the Pentagon, a fairly large office in Cambridge, and an office in Austin, Texas. And if you think about why those places, the Pentagon obviously makes sense, but Cambridge and Austin and Silicon Valley are three of the biggest tech and innovation hubs in the United States. The Secretary put us out there, so that was the first step. It was commitment with resources from the Department of Defense to essentially say we want to change the way that we do business within the Department of Defense. But we still needed congressional help. So in 2016, the National Defense Authorization Act had language that was put into it that essentially said the Department of Defense has the ability to use a separate contracting vehicle away from what we call the FAR-based contracts, so the Federal Acquisition Regulation contracts. And that other method is something called an Other Transaction Authority. And that initial language allowed us to start a process at DIUX out in Silicon Valley where we now take a problem from a warfighter. Let's say Tom, in fact, I know Tom has lots of problems. I'm sure of it because we've talked about them. So Tom can come to DIUX and any Navy customer or Army or Air Force, and they can say, we have this problem that we need solved. And so we take and we develop a problem statement, not a requirement statement like the Pentagon likes to speak, but a problem statement that is very generic, very broad. We don't tell them how we want to solve it based on 3 or 4 years worth of experience before, based on many admirals telling us how they think that we should solve it. We just have a problem. We advertise that on a website, www.diux.mil. It's something called a commercial solution opening that anyone within the entire world, because we can also work with foreign vendors, can tell us essentially, and they submit on the website just a short 10-slide solution set of how they would go about solving that user's problem. The user, in conjunction with DIUX, then meets, and we look at all of the submissions. We fill out forms. This is all contracting language that has to go through legal, so on and so forth. And we down select that to, let's say, we go from 30 to 6. We ask those 6 people, those 6 companies, to submit what we call a full submission brief. And we bring them to Silicon Valley. We sit down for 90 minutes with each of them, with the customer there in a room, and we talk more in detail about what the problem set is. We get to know them, they get to know us. It's the very beginning formation of that face-to-face partnership that takes place. And it's really a great thing to watch because you get to see kind of how these people that are primarily in the commercial space get a little bit of that, wow, I'm making a difference, like some of the stuff that we get to feel in the military and in NGOs and in other parts of the government. And from there, they submit their 90 minutes. We meet again with the customer. The customer then and DIUX down selects to 1 or 2, and then we issue something called a request for prototype proposal. So a lot of people that have dealt with government in the contracting, normally this is called a request for proposal, an RFP. And at that point, normally with a FAR-based contract, all discussion with that contractor has to stop. In the RPP process under an OTA, the collaboration begins right then. So you're able to talk about statement of work, you're able to collaborate on technical requirements, you're able to collaborate and talk about price, you're able to negotiate all through the entire process. And at the end of that, if you can agree on the statement of work, you can agree on the technical requirements, and you can agree on the price, and there's enough money that the customer ended up bringing to DIUX for it, we end up signing something called an other transaction agreement. And that is then the kickoff of the prototype. And then again, like I mentioned with Saildrone, if that prototype is successful, then you have the ability, if the customer wants to continue to move on forward with it, the ability to put it into something that resembles like a GSA schedule. We call it a production other transaction, where anybody within the government can say, well, this was successful, we don't have to compete it again, we can go just and buy it line item, whether it be service, software as a service, data as a service, hardware, software, whatever it ends up being. And so that's the general process. So to your point, there is a methodology that we've developed so that companies like yours have the ability to go faster. Real quickly on the time frame, and then I'll shut up for a second. So generally from the time that we advertise that problem to the time that it's a contract is signed is less than 90 days. The fastest we've done it in is 21 days. So we are breaking the walls that the Secretary asked us to do, and that process is exactly it.
Can I actually comment on something? Because I used to work at the Department of Interior and also before that at OMB, and I think the one thing, just listening to the commander and what I think Secretary Carter did that was really good is, in the federal government, we are very risk averse. It is just a very risk averse environment. And so when you're talking about messing around with other transactions through the FAR, most people, unless you're given in a direction from very high, something like this is set up, it is just very insurmountable to try to change. So one of the things that might just really be a recommendation is trying to figure out with some key agencies how you get above that kind of risk aversity level, because for most folks in the federal government, taking that type of risk, or what the private sector says, usually it's okay to fail, just fail fast, are not things that the public sector feels really very comfortable with or is necessarily celebrated if you're a public servant.
It's a good way to make your comptroller have a stroke. That being said, once you kind of get them through and walk them through the process, it's amazing how fast they come on board. You can show them the regulation. It's 2371 Bravo within the JFR. There is language, and this is law, and so we have the ability to use it. But it's just the unfamiliarity that really causes people the reticence.
I saw we had another question.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm John Bird with the National Society of Professional Surveyors, NSPS, and also we represent the Digital Coast Partnership and Advocacy Coalition. And I was going to throw a softball up at Rebecca and her group, because they're a member of the Digital Coast Partnership. But I wanted to throw the softball up to the panel to comment on the program, the project that's run out of NOAA's Charleston, South Carolina office. And how it is a prime example of a public-private partnership. And to piggyback on Chris's comments about proper roles and responsibilities spelled out beforehand, it is the leading example for coastal issues, and just wanted to compliment NOAA. But from your all's vantage point, the different groups that you represent, do you have some comments or thoughts about what you've heard about Digital Coast Partnership and what it means to a lot of different constituencies out there, and why the P3 works in the first place.
I know that. Well, I know John from a former life when I was up on the hill doing a lot of coastal mapping and stuff. So I will tell you that my knowledge is not probably as current as I'd like it to be. But yeah, no, I think where you can leverage the tools that the private sector has, and this is a good one for public good. So you're using those, again, those, like I said, the skills to create a public service and sharing in those risk and reward. I think those are really kind of those sweet spots where as long as you keep that going, you can have quite a bit of success.
I think that leads us into a question that someone had submitted during the registration process was, what are the biggest benefits from public-private partnerships? And on the flip side, what are the biggest costs?
So for me, there are multiple benefits, and one is that it extends our reach and gives us greater capacity than we would have without that partnership. And because we serve the public, it allows us to help them in a way that we wouldn't be able to help them if we didn't have these partnerships. So I think in that respect, it's beneficial. And the second part of your question was
Costs.
the costs. So they're time consuming, and you have to make sure that you do map out the roles and responsibilities of each of the partners. And that's probably the greatest lesson that I've learned over the years, is that before you enter into a partnership, you need to have that really well-defined roles and responsibilities for each of the partners. And you also need to or should spend some time developing trust with your partners, because I think that's very important at the initial stages as well as towards having a successful partnership, is to have those trust relationships. And then finally, to have some goals that you develop together. And I have been in partnerships where we've had very different goals coming into the partnership and coming out of the partnership, and those have been partnerships that were not as solid as, so kind of a bad date, but not, really a bad date, but a rocky date, we'll say. But the really good dates are when you can develop those goals ahead of time and share them and work toward them and have accountability on the part of all the parties.
Yeah, I'd echo what Pamela said. In terms of, I'll start with the difficult part. The time constraints can be very difficult for the federal government, where you might have a limited number of staff that can work on an innovative approach. The time it can take can be very difficult. And then on the private side, I think they're looking as time is money. So the time that it can take the federal government or private sector to wrap itself around it can really be a huge constraint. I love the date. I'm going to steal the date analogy now from whenever talking about it. But it's true. It's also just, it can be really messy. I think sometimes people forget that there's like the public-private partnership, and then there's like all the in-laws or something that's surrounded, in the sense that like there's a lot of other stakeholders that care about what that public-private partnership is being formed. They might not like always support it. And so also making sure you're like, okay, it's not just me and my partner, it's actually everybody that could be affected by this that I actually need to figure out either what they're going to see as pros and cons and how I'm going to, think about it. Now, if you get through all of that, what I think is tremendous opportunity is the ability for innovation, whether it's innovation of ideas or technologies, is so much greater when you're bringing different skill sets to it. And also, I think in really kind of constrained budget environments, it can bring new financing into projects that we otherwise wouldn't have, but that the government side might have other benefits to actually bring to the private sector, proof of a technology that then can go out to the market, and that kind of stamp of approval of a federal agency. So there's a lot of benefits in my mind around that kind of innovation, public stamp of approval that can have really tremendous benefits for both sides.
Yeah, so to piggyback on the cost piece, I guess generally my answer to the question would be I think the risks of this sort of partnership are dwarfed by the rewards. There are risks. There's risks in any sort of action that you take in life. But regarding the money piece, if you look at a graph of essentially from 1945 at the end of World War II until today, you'll see essentially two lines that diverge starting about 1985-ish, about the end of the Cold War. And up until that point, they were in lockstep. And those two lines that I'm talking about are essentially commercial research and development spending compared to government research and development spending. And since the end of the Cold War, the commercial has outpaced, I think it's up to 3 to 1 now. So for every $1 that the government as a whole spends in research and development, the commercial world is spending 3. So what does that mean for us? Nobody here has budget problems, right? So essentially what we're doing by wedding ourselves to these various different companies that are in the very beginning stages sometimes of research and development is you're taking and you're leveraging within the government venture capital money that has come in specifically at the seed level and Series A, B, and C levels for the purposes of research and development that the taxpayer had to pay nothing for. And all we're doing is leveraging that piece, providing with them with a little bit of money on an initial contract for a prototype, and then getting all of that research and development money back, right? So in this times where so much of the federal government is already spoken for as far as cost, I think it's critical. If we don't partner with these people, we're going to end up just continuing to fall farther and farther behind. And on top of that, if we don't partner with them, you can be sure that our adversaries will. So think about that for a second. If not only are we falling behind because we can't outspend our adversaries, but now because we're choosing to go about doing things the way that we used to do, now we're actually going to get surpassed in areas like artificial intelligence and autonomy and other areas. So it's absolutely critical that we look at this from a risk reward, and the risks just blow away the rewards blow away the risk.
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. Something that I don't think about in my daily grind with research. There were a set of 3 questions that all sort of pertain to the same topic. They're very eloquently worded, so I don't know if I want to try and summarize all of them, but it's sort of under the topic of research and tobacco science and tainted results. So one of these questions is, what protections are necessary in public-private partnerships to ensure independent results of such effort? And then piggybacking on that question, how do you develop a partnership or discuss how to develop a partnership when it's known that the ultimate findings of the research may be at cross purposes to one of the partners? So do any of you have any experience with this? I know that there are people in the audience that do and may like to share that. It's a different aspect. I think it attacks or addresses more the research perspective than the technology.
I can offer, I'm actually interested in somebody that's had kind of with the second example, that experience, because in some ways you could say that's counter to what a public-private partnership should be, in the sense of you're trying to look for joint sharing of risks and rewards and then kind of a common gain. So I'd actually like to hear more about the second example. On the first one, the reason why I started out by saying think of a public-private partnership as a contractual agreement is when you think about contracts, you tend to think about going into something that's very legally binding and that you're going to think through. And I think that's just very true of a public-private partnership. It's like from the very beginning, your success is going to be about the plans that you put in place up front and keeping those communications open. Having the bad dates, as everybody is talking about, and then also knowing when that date is not going to lead you, down the aisle or whatever it is, and and then stopping there, and that's kind of the part of the fail quickly if you're gonna fail on it. But that's a little bit why I think of it. You want to think about it as contractual, so that you're really thinking from the very beginning, how do I plan this out? It's fun to say, hey, let's go do a public-private partnership, but I think as Pamela said, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of energy, and you have to build that into the process.
Anybody from the audience want to comment on some of the infrastructure or methodologies to try to avoid some of those things? I think that when I think about the ones that I've been involved with the joint industry program, the Sound and Marine Life, there are a lot of different stakeholders coming together on a common problem. And perception is always something that people are aware of. So does science, for the Sound and Marine Life ocean sound issue, if they do find that a particular source elicits a particular behavior or impact, is that driven by one of the stakeholders? And I think that really illustrating, and I think you guys have said this, the shared vision. The shared vision isn't whether the impact is good or bad. The shared vision is identifying the impact so you can deal with that in a responsible way. And so I think that shared vision really comes down to being open with that early. And I think with that shared vision, you sort of avoid some of those perceptual potential claims that a research group or a research project may be heavily influenced by one of the partners. And I just know from my experience that shared vision and really laying it out very clearly at the beginning is one of the key elements for success. Anybody have any other experience in the room with
Bill Michaels with NOAA Fisheries. I manage the technology portfolio. I've been with NOAA for 40 years, 30 years involved with technologies, a wide variety of technologies. And underwater acoustics is a very interesting example where researchers in the private sector has created really good partnerships. There are particular companies that show up at the different conferences. They interact very closely with the researchers, not only for instrumentation, but also software. And what happens is if the private sector really engages with these scientific conferences and with the scientific community, they begin to see new algorithms or updates. And if they respond well to the scientific community with these upgrades, they capture the international community. And I think the underwater acoustics are some really excellent examples with that type of partnership. So when I see when I communicate with private sector, that's a recommendation I give. But on the other side of the coin, where the researchers are trying to, especially in the government, they're trying to develop the technologies. They can leverage industry. And in fact, they really need to communicate for like small business initiative grants. They're not very good with the market research. They know what their needs are. But by them communicating with the private sector, they really get a good sense of what topics would be successful with those small business initiative grants. And there's quite a bit of money there to leverage that partnership. So from my experience, industry really should engage with that scientific community at scientific conferences.
So you're right about the acoustic piece. One of my babies at DIUX is an OTA that actually touches on the industry piece, the foreign piece, and international piece, as well as the need for this sort of technologies for everybody that in this room would be interested in. It's a company called Wireless for Subsea. They work with a lot of people like you, ma'am, in the oil industry. for the purposes of putting either on the seafloor on a node, or put this device on a UUV for the purposes of data gathering, but you have to be able to communicate that data. And the communications under the water, as any submariners in the audience will tell you, and lots of people here know as well that have worked in the undersea UUV realm, is very difficult. So this prototype that we're developing right now with ONR FEDECO is for the purpose of developing essentially a cell phone under the water that switches between 3 modalities, between acoustic, optical, and RF, for the purposes of seeing which one is communicating most efficiently given the environment. And this is a Scottish company that we signed the contract with. Most of their commercial applications are with oil and gas, but yet the applications within the Department of Defense and within NOAA and the fisheries community is really, really vast.
Yeah, I was laughing a bit when Jen prompted that. So I wanted to get away from acoustics, but I'm going to highlight 2 things you said, Chris. Regulatory drivers push some of these along faster than they should, than they would naturally happen. But at the same time, the regulatory drivers probably hindered a lot of progress that we could have made collaboratively. And so it gets really tricky when you get into private industries on that side. And so regulatory drivers make everybody risk adverse. And so that's been a large problem. And it's been a problem for other agencies, for some agencies, but not others. So it's much easier for us to work with DOI because they regulate us more directly, they understand the business, than it is for Department of Commerce. And it's been that way. But like probably a lot of the fishing groups, oil and gas and energy industry in general is risk adverse as well. I can't even I can't even use the word partnership until my lawyers have seen a signed paper. So it's a collaboration. So the risk adverse is something, but what we've figured out is we're saying, you know, shared goals and commonalities, but sometimes it's really just one thing. So what we've kind of looked at in the Gulf of Mexico, and I'll use an Ocean Conservancy example. Pam knows this very well, but after the oil spill, Ocean Conservancy has put a lot of work into understanding what are the data gaps in the Gulf of Mexico. The largest data gap is the blue water, deep Gulf. And so who's out there every day? Industry, right? The oil and gas. So Ocean Conservancy came and said, you know, this is our biggest gap. We've worked together. We've known each other, so relationships go a long way in establishing partnerships. What can we do together? You know, is there something that industry could help bring to the table? And so we started on a small goal. We didn't try to link everybody together, right? So we all have our respective positions. We all report in our respective pieces of the partnership. But really trying to find just the simplest common goal. Ocean observing is another easy one. We have millions of dollars that are going into these systems that are observing for safety, for environmental knowledge, all of this information. But it's always been risk adverse to share that because there hasn't been a platform to put it in. So even some of our other partnerships are developing structures like in the DIUX framework where industry can share their data and they're confident in that it's being used for the public well-being versus it being used for a regulatory driver. So really some of the partnerships that we've had to develop are really to get people around the table to deal with what your risk adversities are. Because usually it's a misperception. And once you can do that, then you can start working towards some common goals. So technology is a big one for a lot of industries. Being able to use some of this technology, the government has to catch up, and it's typically slow, which is why I love hearing from your side, Commander, is because we've had those issues as well in the industry. So sometimes it's easier for us to work with military than it is for other federal organizations. But the risk adverse is not only it's on that side, it's on our side, but really it's getting people around the table. So what I'd like to see come out of some of this, as well as things like the National Ocean Partnership Program, is how can those be reinvigorated to get people around the table more often, identifying some of those issues. Acoustics was a big one, and for a long time, both the Navy and the industry as well as academics got around the table to try to figure this out, and they continue to do that. So what are some of those other issues? And really, if you can get some kind of framework where you can get the risk adversity off the table because you bring these groups together to work it out, then it's less about finding the issues, right? You're dealing with the elephant in the room first, and then you can start really driving the science or technology. So it's starting to happen more, but it's not happening enough, right? So some of these issues are still going to be there, so it'd be really nice to see what can we get off the table so that we can get it working much better.
You bring up an excellent point, and Rebecca, who couldn't be with us, brought up that same point too. She's like, it's very clear that public-private partnerships are happening. It's very clear that they can be extremely successful, and it's very clear that leveraging within those partnerships is very important to the overall success of the partnership. But, she says, we're not doing it enough. There's so much room for improvement. And essentially what you said, Ruth. So how do we what are those steps that we need to take to break down barriers or obstacles to make some of these partnerships happen more easily, more often?
So one suggestion, and this comes from a university-based set of lenses, and that is to introduce our faculty researchers to these opportunities and encourage and inspire them to seek public-private partnerships, because I think there are a lot of opportunities for our university researchers to engage in them, and if they receive credit for these opportunities and partnerships, that I think is key, because often faculty only receive credit for their competitive grants that they bring in from places like NIH and National Science Foundation, and sometimes at research-intensive universities, the funding that they receive from private entities is not viewed as competitive or as worthy or as high as competitive sources are. And so I think we need to have a conversation around enabling our researchers at universities and rewarding them for seeking out private entities and developing partnerships with them.
It's a good comment, especially because those developing that takes time, and that should be recognized as part of the process. Yeah, I agree with that.
And one thing I think Ruth was also alluding to in your comments, and I think it's a really good one, is sometimes don't start huge. Start with the small and build the trust and build the relationship, and then you can kind of go up to that next level, because that reduces risk and on both sides. And I actually think that's a really kind of key thing. Sometimes it's just starting small and having the relationship too.
Yeah, a little bit more touchy-feely, and there's definitely been some stuff that has been said that I think is the opposite of this, but I think that when you're dealing with the commercial realm, you need to presume positive intentions. There cannot be ad hominem type of attacks on various parts of industry, no matter if they end up agreeing with you or not agreeing with you. There should be a common goal, and if there's a common goal that will result in the furthering of either or both agendas, then it could be a successful partnership. But if there's something outside of that, it's probably better to run sooner. So that's my only statement on that.
I think the other thing I just want to mention is make sure that when you go into this, you think about each of the different partners involved. So I think, Commander, you were alluding to this earlier on in the discussion, but if you're the private sector, whether it's nonprofit or a for-profit company, realize they have certain interests that have to go into that, and be realistic about those interests, be realistic about your interests too, so that you as the other partner are always thinking about what those interests might be too. So it's always kind of the idea of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes to think through this as you're part of that partnership. And I think that also helps you decide when, okay, maybe this isn't going to work, because if I realize that we're not going to come to agreement here, we should acknowledge we tried and move on quickly.
One more thing, I think there's another thing on the public side. We're used to working at a certain way. We talked about speed. A very tactical and tactile, I guess I would say, thing that we can end up doing is in the commercial sector, if you're written an email, generally, at least in Silicon Valley, they want a response within 4 hours, certainly within a day. not within a week. And I would say that if you find yourself in these sort of partnerships and you find you have too many emails to answer, maybe you're not focused enough to be involved in a partnership. And that's a really important point, because these people, their jobs matter, and they're going to disengage and not ever come back with their technology if we let them down in that regard.
And there's an audience.
Yeah. Hi, so Stanley Willis. I spent 25 years in the Navy and had a chance to direct and be a commanding officer of an interagency partnership. And then I was fortunate to be the founding director of the Integrated Ocean Observing Partnership, or the Ocean Observing System Office. And I'd like to say two things. One, it kind of goes to the discussion of, you know, you got to have a belief in the intent. I was the director of the National Ice Center, which is Coast Guard, Navy, and NOAA, and we had all the agreements. But I guarantee you that if you don't have the intent to make it work, you can get around any of those agreements. So it's to your last comment, John, that you can't be throwing the slings and arrows across the tables. You've got to believe in the partnership, and you've got to believe in that intent, and that's hard to quantify. As Rebecca, and I'm sorry she's not here, we need to be able to do these public partnerships more and improve on that. The thing that I would say there is take a look at the infrastructures that we have already built. You have the Integrated Ocean Observing System that has 11 regional associations that bring together state, local, tribal government, academia, and industry. You have the Sanctuary Program, which is place-based, that brings together the public and the stakeholders. You have Sea Grant that also works in that same space. You have the Estuary Program that works. We heard about the Digital Coast Partnership. Those partnerships are out there, and we really need to take and bolster them. I don't think we need new structures and new partnerships. I think we really need to put our money where in those frameworks that we've already built. So I just encourage people to think about that. I'm very interested to see if the DIUX, it'd be great if that could become a government-wide, because I also work with the U.S. group on Earth observations, and the second national plan wants to have an entire, observing enterprise. So how do you take what you've done, not only scaling up to improve defense acquisition, how can we scale up and improve government acquisition?
So one of the things, good to see you, by the way. One of the things that we are doing in order to try to scale is DIUX would be fine if we were put out of business in the next 5 years, because the concept and the processes of the other transaction were so embedded within the culture and the Pentagon that everyone was using it for exactly the purposes you're talking about. So there are certain groups that are coming to us that whenever they sign an OTA and go through the CSO process, they send a contracting officer along with them. And we plant that seed, and then they take it back into the various different comptroller and contracting shops all across the Department of Defense. And it's actually spreading really fast.
Hi, Paul Zaninos with Apt Associates. One quick point on a point that you just made, Chris, the idea of start small and then take it from there. That's back to the dating analogy. Maybe there's this end game of a marriage, who knows? But a lot of times people will jump to this concept of a strategic partnership. Well, we have to form a strategic partnership with this, whether it's business to business or business to government, and so your eyes are like way bigger than your stomachs. And you kind of lose track of what the scope really ought to be, and it just almost fails before it even starts if you try to do too much too fast. So that's one point. The other point is, on the point, I didn't catch your name, Michelle Oil, Ruth. So you triggered something for me, because I was trying to think of a kind of a household example of a public-private partnership that actually everybody in this room is already a member of. You know what that is? Okay, so I'm going to tell you. It's Energy Star. If you think about the Energy Star program, everybody here has probably bought an appliance, a computer monitor, a laptop, a radio, a stereo, where they all have this label, right? Well, how did that happen? That's all about EPA and DOE getting together in the 1970s and saying, we got to do something about energy efficiency. And so what was their first reaction? They're going to go, oh, we're going to regulate the heck out of every commercial manufacturer of every electronic device made in the U.S. That went over like a lead balloon. So the concept of collaboration, the concept of voluntary programs. So Energy Star is a 100% voluntary program that has driven energy efficiency to new heights in the U.S. because of the incentive to compete among each other for the customer's business. So we're living an example. I mean, we're living with an example of a public-private partnership that probably I'd be willing to challenge anybody to come up with one that's been more impactful, you know, and more of a household word. So I just wanted to kind of raise that point.
We're going to be coming to our end of our time here, but I wanted to shift the topic a little bit. I don't want anyone to leave this room without discussing how, and I'm going to address this to our panel first. In your experience, are public-private partnerships used in education and to support the development of our future workforce? Workforce development is definitely a key issue, I think, of many partnerships.
So I'm going to take an education example. And I'm going to take off my Sea Grant hat and put my faculty research professor hat on now. And one of the coolest partnerships I developed last year was with an organization called OSearch. And some of you may be familiar with OSearch. They open source satellite tracking of sharks around our world's oceans. And since 1990, I've been putting satellite transmitters on sea turtles, studying sea turtle migratory behavior in different oceans. And I really wanted to open source that data and give it a much higher profile and platform. And so I contacted Chris Fisher from OSearch and asked him if he would put some of our sea turtles on his app and on his website. He has several million people who log into his app and his website daily. And so if you download the app or go to his website, you can see 3 of my turtles swimming around the Eastern Pacific Ocean right now. Look at Edith. She's the rock star of all the sea turtles I have ever tracked. She's an olive ridley sea turtle. And we caught her on a beach in Costa Rica, put a transmitter on her in November, and she has just been swimming to the west ever since. And so hopefully she'll keep on transmitting and help us learn about where she's going and where she lives during the non-nesting season. And one of the cool things about OSearch is they have, in collaboration with Landry's Restaurants, developed some really great ocean education curricula for kids in K through 12 grades. And so this fall, in between dealing with Hurricane Harvey recovery and response, I went out to about a dozen local schools and used the curriculum that was developed by OSearch to teach kids about ocean circulation and ocean animals. And for me, that was a very rewarding thing that I probably won't get any credit for towards tenure, but that's okay. And but it was, for me, it was my part of developing that next generation of ocean leaders and ocean scientists who are going to be inspired by the work that we're doing to track ocean animals and learn more about their behavior and that of our oceans. So, so that's my education example. And then the workforce development, everything we do with the Texas shrimp fishery in Texas has to do with workforce development. So we had a great program that was funded by the USDA for several years where we trained shrimp fishermen how to develop business plans. We trained them how to store their catch on board so that it was more appealing by the time they offloaded their catch onto the docks and brought it to market. We taught them how to work with the retail industry. We taught them how to use turtle excluder devices so that they could avoid penalties for non-compliance if they were not using those turtle excluder devices correctly. And so we did a lot of work in all different dimensions of that workforce to help them be sustainable. And those things, in addition to the example I gave you early on when I talked about introducing new technology into their gear to help them reduce fuel costs, sustained and, in my opinion, saved that fishery at a time when it needed to be saved. And so we continue to do a lot of work with that fishery. There is continuous turnover in that fishery. They need training, and especially now as there are limitations on H-2B visas, we have a need to train people who can actually do work that they've never been trained to do before. So we're continuing to work with our public partnerships and develop the workforce in Texas.
I'm going to say yes to both education and workforce, but I don't have too much direct experience. One of the things we're trying to do in Florida as part of the recovery from the hurricane is there was a lot of marine debris that was either lobster traps or just debris washing offshore. And the dive industry and the commercial lobster industry is having a very difficult time. So one of the things we're actually looking at is how to use the skills that the lobstermen have, that the divers have, to go in and actually clean up the marine debris. So during a time when they're having some economic hardship, be able to turn that into a plus for the resource. So that's kind of our first time doing it. But I think there's just tons of applications for public-private partnerships, especially in the technology space, and getting a lot of youth trained up to kind of be the next scientists and the next explorers.
I think you guys nailed it.
Anybody from the audience have any success stories that they really wanted to share on partnerships for workforce development? John.
Thank you. I'm John White from COL. Following my own rules. When you talk about the education and you talk about, workforce development in the future, I would like to remind people, can you raise your hand if you've ever been involved in a National Ocean Sciences Bowl, regional or national? All right, about half the audience has been involved in what is a public-private partnership run by the Consortium of Ocean Leadership, formerly run by CORE, started by Admiral Watkins and Rick Spinrad as they gained that as a means to develop the ocean scientists of the future. How many of you, have anybody ever been a participant as a high school student in the National Ocean Sciences Bowl? Anybody, a participant? No, other than Kelsey, my daughter. Anybody else? I know I've met several. There's a postdoc, an associate professor at the University of Miami, Rasmus, and you've been a participant. Was that somebody over there? No, okay. Anyway, what I'm telling you is that there's several people at the academic institutions inside of government. I know there's a NOAA Corps officer who was a participant as well. That is a public-private partnership run by a nonprofit organization because they get federal funding for the program. They get personal private sponsorship. We get industry sponsorship as well. So I would suggest that when we take a look at these things, don't forget about the opportunities, small or whatever, like our National Ocean Sciences Bowl. It's been a long time, a public-private partnership. It's a partnership, and so it has been a good marriage for 21 years now. The marriage needs a little counseling, a little injection of resources that you might say. Maybe a new post-nuptial agreement, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But I still think that's an example. Looking at means like that to really to look at how we're going to educate and build the ocean workforce of tomorrow is important. I just want to point that one out.
Thank you. That's a great private-public partnership that's been going on for a long time. Megan?
Megan Davis with FAU Harbor Branch. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a net ban on fishing in Florida. And so Harbor Branch partnered with Florida Sea Grant, with the state of Florida, and with the fishermen to do a very large retraining program where we retrained, in the end, over 500 fishermen to be clam farmers. And the industry went from a $1 million industry to a $20 million industry. And so it put a lot of people to work, and it also allowed the communities to grow from that retraining.
Oh, that is a huge success story. I'm seeing my 3-minute flash. So in final comments, I'm going to ask you to think outside of your individual organization or initiatives and outside of individual products. And any closing thoughts on how public-private partnerships can advance national ocean science and technology?
I think one word that I've been, as I was listening to the morning sessions, data is something that everybody in this room needs, and there is data science for the purposes of machine learning, for then the eventual purposes of artificial intelligence that is catching on huge. And if you could, if I could think of just one thing that everybody in this room could partner on, it would be that specific technology.
Data management, data assimilation, data archiving, data, what type of data?
So it all goes into that. You have to be able to do all of those things for the purposes of having a machine well, essentially to build a software algorithm that has the ability then to ingest new information for the purposes of machine learning. And from there that's kind of the foundation for artificial intelligence.
I'm going to say two things because it picks up on what the commander said and also what the Senator Murkowski was really saying is that data and really trying to figure out, understand, and use big data can have huge opportunities for us. It's often the public that's collecting it, but it's actually if you can put it in the hands of private companies and sometimes private individuals, the things that you can develop with to really push things forward can be incredible. I saw a lot of that at the Department of Interior when we started making much more data available. So I do completely agree with the data has a huge potential in this day and age with technology to move things forward. I think the other thing when you talk, because you went big picture with the kind of national ocean technology and exploration and science, I think this goes back to maybe something Ruth was getting at, is if you think about that, that can be a huge thing. So there's a question I would have is to say, what does a roadmap look like first, and what are those building stones that you would want to get to the bigger picture? So again, that's a huge one. So what are the bite-sized pieces we really can kind of pick off and deal with in order to create that much larger environment?
I just wanted to end by saying, never go on a blind date. If you're on a date and it's not going well, tell your date that you have a headache and go home. And if your date does result in marriage, renew your vows, maybe after 5 or 10 years.
Thank you. That is, I'm not even gonna try and top that. That was perfect ending. Can we please give all of our panelists here a round of applause?